Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This week, there's not going to be a lot of activity, formal activity, because I know you're working on your essays. Your job this week is to get a draft produced for peer review exchange next week. I'll get some stuff up for you later on today or tomorrow morning at the earliest. But this essay is basically, in terms of the basic requirements, it's the same as the one before in terms of word count and typefaces and number of external sources and so forth. The requirements are all the same. It's just that the secondary material on this one will be the material we've covered in this writings unit rather than the material from the previous unit, the Pentateuch. But other than that, the requirements are exactly the same. I did want to talk a little bit about the timeline of the creation of this text, and now seems like as good a time as any to do it. Some students really are into this stuff. Some students don't care at all. And so I don't make a huge deal out of it. But, people wonder, how did this thing get into this shape? Well, it turns out just like any other complex piece of literature like this, it's a process of editing and shaping and people making decisions about what goes in and what didn't get in. We know this is not all the material there was. There are references to around 20 external sources in the Old Testament material that are not included there, but we know they existed because they are referenced. Like the book of Joshua is one, the book of the Annals of the King is another one, there's a book of the Annals of King David, another one. So we know there were all sorts of stuff around. So what was the process by which these materials got selected to be scripture and other materials didn't? Well, lots of complex decisions, and frankly, it's probably political more than anything else. The books that got in are the books that had the most support at the council, which we'll talk about in a moment. And again, not terribly important unless you're interested in this kind of thing, and unless it helps you, if you're doing a compare-contrast, if it helps you place things in sort of chronological order. So I've got a little handout which I'm going to put up for you. It's called The Development of Israel and Its Sacred Texts. You should know going in that the early dates that I mentioned here are mere speculation. We don't know about these dates. It seems reasonable. It's a pretty good guess. But there are no external references to this nation of Israel up until around 700 BCE or so. So everything prior to that is speculation on the part of historians and archaeologists and so forth. But I want to take you through this fairly quickly, and then we can have a little discussion about it in the discussion board if you want to. If you're interested in the more complex analysis of how this takes place, Gable chapter 6 is really good. So you should read that if you're interested. I'm not requiring you to read it, but if you're interested, you should read it. So the first thing to say is if there's no evidence that supports that one guy sat down and wrote this thing all the way through. In fact, all the evidence we have suggests, just like with any other literature, that it's a process of selection that took possibly 2,000 years or 2,500 years before the Hebrew scriptures gelled into what they are today. So let's begin with the development of the culture as it indicates in your handout here. This group of people started out in prehistory, a bunch of wandering nomads wandering around in the desert out there, unnamed and unorganized. And then they began to coalesce, probably for protection for themselves, and also because they found places to water their flocks or so forth and so on. And they began to organize in what is called a house. Now, a house is a completely independent entity. Most of them, the historical records and the archaeology seem to suggest about 100 to 200 people, including the patriarch and his wives and their minor children and their animals and their servants and their sort of hangers-on, maybe a couple hundred people in the house of whoever. And of course the house was named after the patriarch. Still completely independent organizations, probably traded with each other, obviously, but no sort of formal arrangement between these houses, and we don't know how many of those there were. Then they began to coalesce into tribes related by birth and blood and marriage and so forth. And that at that point, this particular group began to be called the children of Aber, or the Hebrews. I mentioned the date of the house of Abraham, maybe 1800 BCE. Some scholars accept that. Other scholars say no, it couldn't possibly be, because the organization of the house of Abraham, as it's listed in the Bible, it implies a much later, because it's a much more complex arrangement. And so it wouldn't have been 1800, it would have been later than that. That doesn't really matter. I just mentioned the date so we have a reference point. You can take the date or leave it. And then we see all of this happens before any of the history that's even reported in the biblical material. Then we get the house of Jacob gets some kind of preeminence. Jacob's house is changed to Israel. And we have the house of Israel, which becomes the nation of Israel. Okay, then we now have a nation identified as a group of houses. I suppose it's roughly equivalent to the say we have a nation of the United States. That's a rough federation of individual states. It's something like that. Okay, then they get taken into Egypt. It's either indentured servitude where they agree to go, or they're captured in war or something like that, or they're driven there by famine. But anyway, they end up in Egypt and they serve a period of indentured servitude or slavery, however you wish to look at it. At this point, they are a subjugated people under the Egyptians, and then they get let go and they go out into the desert and they wander around for a while. And at this point, the organization, as it's laid out in the material, is clearly an army. If you look at the way the camps are laid out, they're military camps with avenues and headquarters and so forth, and they've got a general in control. So it's a military army with its hangers-on moving through the desert. Okay, and then they conquer the land that they're given by their God, or the land that they see themselves being given by their God, and they found a city, and their city is called Jerusalem. Again, I've suggested a date of 1000 or so. No one knows, and again, the dates don't matter. It's just I mentioned the dates to say it's later than the house of Abraham. We don't know how many years, but there the dates are to show a relative time point. At any rate, they develop into a fully developed city/state. They gain political eminence and so forth and so on. They build a big temple where their center of worship is. Then now we get to a point where the events are beginning to be verifiable, because there's references in external records from other nations to this house of Israel, the Beit Israel or Beit David, the house of Israel or the house of David. We begin to see references in the records of other nations. So now we can get a little more dialed in on the dates. 622 BCE, during the reign of King Josiah, they're doing some repairs on the temple, and they find hidden in one of the walls some new laws that nobody knew about. You can take the story however you want to take it, but most scholars say that discovery in the temple walls in 622 is probably a new version of the history that they didn't know about. It's probably what becomes the D source. If you think back to the beginning of our class, we talked about the J, E, D, and P sources. This is the Deuteronomic history, the D source. All right, and then around 700, the northern and southern kingdoms split because they can't get along with each other, or as one scholar suggests, Richard Elliott Friedman suggests the split may have been political, that there was a chief rabbi in Jerusalem and a chief rabbi in the north, and the chief rabbis couldn't get along, so they split up the nation so each could have his own bailiwick. Take it or leave it. But anyway, around 700, the nation split. There is a record here of this Babylonian exile that we're talking about. In 587, the kingdoms are conquered by the Babylonians, and the Sennacherib's prism, which is in the British Museum, is an external record of that. We know this happened, and we know the date because we've got records that incontrovertibly say this happened and around this time. Okay, and I made a link there for you to look at. So the Babylonians take away the northern kingdom, and the southern kingdom also is exiled, and the first exile or the first diaspora takes place, and the first temple, the so-called Solomon's Temple, is destroyed in this time. This is all called the First Temple period. So if you see First Temple period, what they're talking about is from the time of settling in Jerusalem, whenever that was, to this date in 587 when the First Temple was destroyed. That's the First Temple period, or the pre-exile period. And the Babylonians don't keep them very long. They hand them off to the Persians, and King Cyrus allows the the south to return in 538. And in fact, Cyrus's decree is inserted into the biblical text at a place that I've talked about there. However, the northern kingdoms simply go away. They're never heard from again. They become the so-called lost tribes of Israel. That's, an exploration for a history class rather than a literature class. There is this Cyrus's cylinder, which again is a record that we can see and hold. Well, we can't hold it in our hands, but we can see it. And it tells the story of Cyrus allowing the Israelites to return to Jerusalem. And then they rebuild the temple, and they go on for a while. And then there's an incredibly important event in the history of this culture and its literature, and that is in 200. By now, a lot of the Hebrews or the Israelites or the Jews have been dispersed into the Mediterranean area, and some of them go back to Jerusalem, but a lot of them don't. A lot of them have established lives out in Alexandria particularly, and a lot of them stay there. And in the process of assimilation there, they no longer are speaking as a day-to-day language. They're no longer speaking Hebrew. They're speaking the Koine Greek. The lingua franca, or the common language, is not Hebrew in this culture, but it's Greek. And so they're learning Greek, their kids are learning Greek, and they're speaking Greek in their business affairs and so forth. It's not that they don't know Hebrew. It's that they don't use it in their everyday language anymore. So they decide around 200 BCE, one of the most important movements in the entire process of this piece coming together is they decide that the message of their scripture is more important than the language. Now this is huge, because for the Hebrews, the ancient Hebrews, the Hebrew itself is holy. The language itself is holy. And you weren't supposed to change, to translate the Hebrew into something else would have been to take the holiness or the sacredness out of it for the ancient Hebrews. Well, in 200, they're a pretty cosmopolitan culture, and they're living in Alexandria and other places around the Greek-speaking world. And they think, wait a minute, our scriptures are so important that everybody needs to be able to read them. And so we're going to translate these into the vernacular. This is the first time this has ever happened in the entire history of this material that we know of. And it's for reasons that I've just explained. So the legend is somebody collects up 70 scholars, and they work for 70 days, and they produce 70 identical versions of the translation of this material. Take that or leave it, but that's where the word Septuagint, it means the work of the 70, and it's the production of the translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. It's the most important, to say it again, the most important movement in the whole process of the development of this literature. Okay? Probably the Septuagint was one of the things that was destroyed at the Great Fire at the library in Alexandria, because we don't have any originals of it. And then the Second Temple is destroyed by the Romans in 70 of the Common Era. And it is possible, as I've suggested here, it's possible, even likely, that as the Romans were coming to destroy the Second Temple, the priests grabbed their scriptures, which would have been to them the most important thing, and took them out to the desert and hid them in these caves around Qumran for safekeeping. Now, the important thing to our purposes about the Dead Sea Scrolls is that they're not identical to the scriptures that we have that have become canonical. I believe, if I remember correctly, and I didn't take the time to look it up, but I believe there are 4 separate versions of the book of Isaiah, and in the Dead Sea Scrolls, pieces of it or the whole thing. There are 4 different versions, and they don't agree with each other, and none of the 4 exactly matches the version that has become canonical in the scriptures, in the Bible. So what that tells us is, even in 70 of the Common Era, the work was still very much in flux, still very much being edited and changed around and revised and so forth. So even as late as 70 AD, this material was still in flux. In 70, the nation of Israel as a political entity goes away, and it is not reconstituted until 1976, so that's a long time. 1900 years, there is no nation of Israel until 1976. What's important in the immediate aftermath of this destruction in 70 of the Common Era, and of course there's other things going on the Christian side, which we'll talk about next semester when we do the Christian scriptures. But what's important to this material and the final step, we think, again, no one will assert this for absolute certainty, but there is a council of rabbis that meets in the town of Jamnia by the seaside there, and they decide, in about 100 of the Common Era, they decide, okay, this is our scripture, this goes in, that doesn't get in. So they make the final decision on the canon. The official list of books is made in 100 in the Common Era or so by these rabbis. Until then, there was no set, solid collection of scriptures. Some places had some places had something different, and there was no official version until the rabbis decide in 100 that now we have an official version. Okay, so remarkably complex, although not that different from any other material of this type. Every collection of material like this goes through this kind of a process. It takes years and years. In this case, who knows when this began to be written down? I would guess They probably didn't have the resources and the scholars until uh, they settled in Jerusalem to actually keep these kinds of records. Certainly there were writings that were carried around, and probably the Pentateuch, the five scrolls, the writing down of the five scrolls predates the settlement in Jerusalem by a lot. But it's my guess, based upon what I know about this kind of literature, that the beginning of the compilation and the composition of most of this stuff wasn't until they settled in Jerusalem, when they had the resources and the scholars and the training to begin to do so. So there's a little bit about the development of the thing and how it came to be. This is supported by evidence, by the way. This is what happened. We know what happened. We have records of it. So I'm going to leave you with that. Do watch for some stuff. I'm going to get some stuff up to remind you this week, and we'll have discussions going on in the forums. But remember, your job this week is to get that draft ready to go for peer review next week. If you're interested in this timeline stuff and you want to talk a little more about it, I'm happy to do that. I'll tell you what I know and what I don't know and what I think I know, if you're interested. And it might be useful as you're thinking about this material to think about when it was produced. And I'll have a little bit about Job in a minute. That'll probably relate more to that. So bye for now. See you shortly. Bye.